Welcome to Fun and Fundraising, everybody, the podcast where we talk with people behind top nonprofit galas and signature fundraising events to showcase how they positively transform their communities. I'm your host, Rob Giardinelli, and today I'm really excited to have my friend Nicholas Rodriguez on as a guest. And Nicholas is a multi-talented performer, director. He works in front of and behind the scenes. And one question that I have frequently gotten and been asked to do an episode like this about talent and managing talent and being talent. And I couldn't think of any better person to do that as Nicholas because of his ability to be in front of and behind the scenes. And also, he lives in New York. I live in Austin, and I've seen him at many of different events in Austin and throughout Texas over the years. And every community is a little bit different. And Nicholas and I actually were talking about that in the green room today. So we're going to talk about that and a whole bunch of other really fun things. So with that, Nicholas, welcome. And we're so excited to have you on as a guest today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So you are a multi-hyphenate, which is, it's a very, very special person that can do that. Tell us a little bit about your path to become an actor and a singer and a
Yeah,
director and any other things I may have missed.
it's interesting. I mean, I think I just grew up, like, even as a young age, doing many, many things at the same time, mostly sports, to tell you the truth, because I grew up in Austin, Texas, and my dad was a coach. So that was the very first path that we took. From football season would end, then baseball, then basketball, then karate, then gymnastics. And then because my grandmother was a musician, there was also piano lessons and everything else involved. So from a young age, I was always juggling a lot of balls and interested in a lot of things. And then once I discovered the arts as a career path, it was just so exciting to me. And I went to the University of Texas. I studied voice and got my master's degree in voice, but always had a passion for acting and dancing. So kind of dabbled in a lot of pots there. And when I moved to New York, my very first agent said, "We can't just pigeonhole you in one thing. If you're going to be successful, you can't just do musicals. We have to send you out for television and film, and then we need to get you involved in concert work." So I always just had people supporting me, realizing to diversify, in my career. And as I got older, that led into wanting to mentorship and to teach in the time that I wasn't performing, which led me to this organization that I'm still affiliated with for the last 15 years. I'm the artistic director of the Broadway Dreams Foundation, which is not for profit that we take Broadway directors, actors, choreographers, writers, casting directors around the country, and we do these arts education intensives for students regardless of their ability to pay. So that's what helped me transition from being solely on stage to being off stage too, and directing and creating. That kind of opened the door to that, which then led to the fundraising and the galas. So it's one thing, one curiosity led to another, led to another. And as they say in this business, it's all the people you know.
It is, but it's also being curious because you mentioned the word curious more than once when we were talking there. So, people wouldn't necessarily think, okay, performing at fundraising events is a way to either, get more gigs and to get yourself out there, but it really is. What motivated you to begin performing at nonprofit galas and signature fundraisers?
Well, let's just be perfectly frank and honest. Like, what motivated me to start was the money. I mean,
Spoken like every true actor.
like young artist getting started, you're like, oh wait, I can make that much money in that amount of time, and that's all I have to do. Okay, great, I'll do that. It's quite different than being in a Broadway musical and doing 8 shows a week, showing up to do the same thing over and over again, which we love doing. But at the same time, it's really nice just to pop in to say, hey, I'm going to fly to this city for 2 days and sing 3 songs and call it a day, be treated really well. It just becomes exciting. And once you start to do it, I always say work begets work, especially in the nonprofit world, because people, they want to go with what they know works. And it's as we all know from fundraising and corporate events and not-for-profit events, fundraising events, it's fast and furious, and you have to put it together and make it look like a Broadway production that had 6 weeks to rehearse. So I think a lot of times, we go to the artist that we trust, we go to the auctioneer that we trust, we go to the caterer we trust, because it's fast and furious. So, and it's part of that too is the adrenaline of making it work in a short period of time.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up, the trust factor, and that, success begets more success. And once you put yourself out there, and I say this, it's really, if you want anyone who wants to get involved in a nonprofit, putting yourself out there may seem really scary, but once you do, it is amazing how many more opportunities come up and bring itself up. And I have one question, and it was interesting because you were talking about how, you'll come in and you'll sing a couple of songs. How is the rehearsal process when you are flying in from one market and you have to come into another? Talk a little bit about how you rehearse and how you prepare, and how you work with nonprofits specifically on, you know, on putting together something that, like you said, makes it look like you've been rehearsing it for 6 weeks, and, that may not be the case.
Sure. I mean, so much of it depends on the venue and the budget, as we all know, in any aspect of it. But I think regardless of the budget or the venue, it always starts with a conversation. So whether I'm singing by myself or whether I've been asked to put together a group of singers locally or outsourced, it always starts with what are you looking for and what is the end result? And trying to shepherd what somebody who might be in development and not necessarily artistic, help them find the middle ground of what they're truly wanting versus what they're looking for, if that makes sense. And then for me, I think the budget negates two things. For instance, I just did a big one, and I just found it more cost effective to rehearse in New York with New York talent versus, because they wanted a Broadway themed show, than to say fly all those people to another city, put them in a nice hotel for 4 days, rent rehearsal space, feed them. So sometimes it just becomes logistic and cost effective. But from a performer standpoint, the interesting thing is oftentimes, we decide on the set list, as you will, or the material, and then you rehearse it by yourself in a vacuum, and then sometimes have 2 hours with the band beforehand, an hour and a half if you're lucky, and that's to do the lights, the sound. Usually they're setting plates, so it's a whole different challenge um, of doing it because you mostly rehearse by yourself in a vacuum, like at that little piano over there.
And Nicholas has a gorgeous new studio where he gets to sing and try things out, and it's really beautiful. And we're recording on a beautiful day on top of that.
Yes.
So, talk a little bit about, because, obviously the subject of the show is fun and fundraising. What is your favorite part about performing at these various nonprofit galas, really all throughout the country?
Honestly, seeing it work, like that, because for me as a creator and as an artist, one of the most fun things is having an idea and pitching it to a client, and then seeing it work in the room and watching the client see it. So it's almost the same thing as being on a Broadway stage or a regional stage, except for oftentimes in those situations, you don't pick the material. You audition for the show, and it's somebody else's material, and you just put in the work. And fundraising, you're doing all of it most of the time. It's your idea, it's your arrangement, you're making it work, and you're being just yourself. So if that's a success, then you win. And it elevates the whole evening. And I say this, no shame to florists, because I know some amazing florists, but 9 times out of 10, the florist is making 20 times what the talent is, but people leave talking about the talent. And I just use florists as one example. So it's an interesting thing where people in fundraising, where dollars get pinched and stretched where they go to. And at the end of the day, if we do our job, everybody's like, those singers were incredible. We want to come back to that event next year.
Absolutely. Well, talk a little, elaborate a little bit more on how talent is just so critical. And because really, when there is good talent, it elevates the experience. And like you said, your jaw may drop when you walk in and you see a beautiful floral bouquet. But the one thing I've learned with galas in particular is you walk away with a feeling,
Yes.
and good talent brings good feeling. And that's the thing that people, talk about for months, if not years on end. So I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit more about that, the important element of talent.
Sure. I mean, I think it's incredible. We've all been there, and we've been to many, many galas and fundraisers, and there seems to be a formula for most of them. We know what to expect. Talent is the wild card, so you never know what you're going to get. And it doesn't, and it kind of falls into two categories. I feel like it's the either named talent that we're coming there to see a huge celebrity, Bernadette Peters, come in and do 2 numbers at our gala, and then other, or just somebody, wow, we didn't know that person, and they blew us away, and they got the mission statement across. So I think there's clearly value in both. When you have a huge name headline talent, Billy Joel, Bernadette Peters, Jimmy Fallon, that's going to help you sell tickets for your event. But it also comes with an expectation. People are coming, they're coming for a show versus the event, and I think when you get really incredible talent, and then really put it towards the mission statement and create something that's special for the event, people's minds are blown. And then they're curious, not only about the organization, but then I want to hear more about that talent. Who was that? Where did you find them? Where can I get more?
Well, I'm glad you bring that up. And there's one question that I do have, and I've never asked this of talent before. Have you, and I've seen this once or twice. Have you, talk a little bit about what it's like when there's multiple different acts that have to perform at a gala within an evening. Talk a little bit about the preparation of that. I'll have a follow-up question to that in a minute, but talk a little bit about that when you're part of a lineup.
I guess the hardest part about that, which can be exciting too, is that inevitably with a gala or an event, there is just a minimal of rehearsal time, and everybody's sharing in the space. So just truly the logistics of point A to point B, having a good stage manager and a good event coordinator to make sure that it all flows evenly, because inevitably somebody's going to be practicing their song while they're putting down the silverware, and somebody's shouting for more plates, just because that's the nature of the time. So with varying acts, like really, I think for those to be successful is really having your time management down ahead of time. And I think what I've run into is oftentimes people will say, oh, I don't need a stage manager, this group is self-contained, or I don't need this, because they know what they're doing. I think the more it can run like a production, the smoother it's going to be for everybody. So that, I think honestly, that is the hardest factor in making it look cohesive, is just time.
Yeah, and there's a chemistry and a camaraderie that I noticed, because if people have different types of points of view with music, it can feel like you're on a roller coaster, and that can be a good thing,
Yeah.
but it can also be a bad thing if the roller coaster stops instead of just kind of going into a lull.
And especially if it's a fundraiser, as most galas are, you want there to be some kind of through line. So if the acts themselves aren't throwing it back to somebody else, a reason why, or a yes-anding to who's coming up or who was just before, then it would at least help if there's like a host that's kind of navigating those waters of why we had this band, and then why we had this children's choir, and then why we had this Broadway singer, to help link it all together.
That's really important advice. I'm really glad that you brought that up, that a good MC really can help maintain a continuity that, especially if you don't have rehearsal time, that makes it seem seamless. And like you said, looks like you have rehearsed it for 6 weeks. Now, there is one other, and I recently saw you, and you were performing duets with the wonderful Sarah Jane Daly.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit, and it was for the Austin Artist Project. I want you to share a little bit more about that event, but talk about how what it's like to work with another performer when you're doing an act together. Because it's one thing to be a part of a lineup, but it's another thing when you're having to do a duet, and you live in one city and the person you're doing the duet with, Sarah Jane, lives in the other. Talk a little bit about, the preparation and to make sure that that's successful.
Well, honestly, it's one of the most fun challenges for me, because I love creating set lists and I love collaboration. And I am a glutton for punishment, so I don't like to do the same things over and over again. And Sarah Jane is very similar. She likes to try new things. So why collaborate with a friend if you can't try something out? So, but honestly, that's what we end up doing a lot in this business. The last few of these I've done, it's been a lot. Luckily, virtual work is really great. The one thing that technology doesn't allow you to do really is rehearse simultaneously. So there'd be a lot of me singing here into my phone and then sending it to her, and she would sing along with me and then send it back to me. via recording. So we would do a lot of that and then just decide, you know what, that key doesn't work. Let's put this key. And then, so we do a lot of that back and forth prep work. And then we'll text message each other like, what is the vibe of the event? What is the demographic of the group? Age range, style range, just so we can get a nice, healthy balance of material, you know? In this instance, Austin is my hometown. I haven't lived there for over 20 years. She lives there now and has the pulse of what's the people will want. So I was really relying on her expertise of who she invited to the event to know how to cater the set list.
That's really important and really key. And I'm glad that you brought up, you live there, but you haven't lived there in a while. And for you, it's kind of like going home again. So that probably also as an entertainer helps relax you a little bit because you've got the good feelings of various things you did throughout your childhood. One thing, it was interesting hearing you talk about how you and Sarah Jane communicated, when you're doing a duet. Talk a little bit more about some trends that you're seeing from a talent or entertainment perspective that you're seeing at galas and fundraisers.
Yeah, the trend that I'm seeing, honestly, is like short and sweet and packs a punch. Is tends to be, at least in the last couple of years, what I've been seeing of the events that I'm doing, and they want something that will tug on the heartstrings without being sentimental. Is another trend that I'm seeing. So and also I feel like less is more is something that I've been seeing as well, as opposed to like say, in some years they'll say, let's get this 100-person children's choir up here to do the event, or now it's like, let's get our 4 best kids and really highlight them. So as opposed to, in a time, and maybe this is post-pandemic that I'm noticing this change. Maybe it's out of a reason that we couldn't all be together, or whether it's budget, but it's awesome in a time management perspective because it's less people to try to corral and schedule and get into one place, and it can be specific and impactful versus general and impactful.
Well, and I'm seeing that more broadly. And it's funny because whenever I talk with people who do things in nonprofit space, they all say something very similar coming out of COVID, that it's people are looking for more specific things. I think like from an auction perspective, I think it's one of the reasons why funding needs have taken off, because you can say, if you give $2,500, it will provide X, Y, or Z. So that intention, it's interesting hearing you say, I never thought about it as a 100-person choir versus let's put our top 4 best kids. They'll really get an impact and they'll see the impact that they're making on a life. Whereas when you're seeing 100 people, that can almost feel like it's just a face in the crowd. So that's a really interesting, an interesting point that you brought up. So thanks for sharing that.
Sure. I mean, and it comes through trial and error. I mean, I've done several of these in several different markets, and it's truly based on the reaction to the clients and the people, and the proof is in the pudding, really.
So I'm glad you brought up the different market piece. So talk a little bit about how you can go about approaching, I want to approach something one way in New York that I know I could never do in Austin, as an example. Talk a little bit about that.
The first thing, sure, absolutely. The first thing, honestly, is that I look at the demographic of the people who's coming to the event, and try to get some information about who they might be, whether it be through the board member that's inviting them or what they do. So that's kind of the first place to start, and an age range. And then I also look to what they've had before, for what worked and what doesn't work. So, and just like anything, like acting, I try to find the similarities in the markets that I know and draw from there. For instance, like I just did this big event in Nashville, and Nashville often gets compared to Austin as far as the music city, size, demographics. So I would really try to draw upon what I knew that worked in one city and what didn't, and then try to find something that's specific to that community to personalize it.
That's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. And that actually, it's like you're clairvoyant here. It actually brings up to my next question, because we can really use this as an example, because you talked about Broadway Dreams earlier and the Texas Performing Arts Center and, your involvement with that. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe you do a lot of behind the scenes stuff with that as well and doing directing. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about each of those two events and kind of how you approached each one differently, because what you might get away with in New York, you can't in Nashville, and vice versa.
Right. So the event that I do in New York that I've done the last few years is called the Broadway Dreams Foundation Gala, which we host at the Plaza every year um, around Christmas time. So as you can imagine, it's gorgeous and it's why people want to come. But having the Plaza in New York is very, very costly, and you have a lot less time because time is money. And of course, because it's in New York, you have your pull from so many people, to choose from as far as band and performers, et cetera, et cetera. And because of that, the expectation is just like so high. So that really has been my trial by fire, which I've really truly enjoyed. And I've been so fortunate to partner with my friend Christopher Hankey, who I'm not sure if you know, actor, many Broadway shows, television shows, movies, but he has his own company called The Bidding Group. He's a host and an auctioneer. He's been doing it for 5, 6 years now, I think, and travels all over the country doing it for various organizations. But because Christopher is also a performer and a host, and he procures these auction items, and he's a comedian, I just have this really great collaborator to bounce ideas off of. And he goes great with the flow, but he's always the first one to say, like, no, 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 I have this really great joke that'll work here that will segue to your next thing. So in New York, he's the person that I bounce things off of. But then I've also been fortunate to work with him in other markets too. So to have that like New York rooted Broadway connection to be able to take to cities around the country and to work with has been such a blessing. But what I find is that going back to what I said, work begets work. The reason I've gotten these other things is because they've been people that have attended my New York gala. So that's pretty much all of the ones that I've directed or been on the production side. It's been somebody that's seen something else I've done. So it's always an easy way to bounce ideas off of, because that client is always saying, well, when you did this thing, can we do that here? So uh, people going back to what people hiring what they know works.
That's fantastic. And, I'd love for you to share a little bit about the Tennessee Performing Arts Center event that you recently directed. I know it's one of Nashville's top galas every single year. So talk a little bit about, how you come in from, being from New York, you go into another market, and you're really and you're putting together a performance that will connect with that specific city.
Sure. Well, that one was really great because the entire team at TPAC was so collaborative and so organized. I think we started having meetings 4.5 months before the event even started. Even from the budgeting standpoint, they had an idea for the overall event, they had the venue, but they were very collaborative of what does it take to do something on this scale. Because they'd done many galas in the past, but this was a benchmark one, and they were launching a huge multi-million capital campaign for a new venue. So the fact that they were so organized on their end and they came in with clear wants and needs, but they were also open to listen, to coordinate. I don't think they'll mind me giving, for instances, like they approached Matt and I to, they wanted a 1 hour Broadway show in the middle of their gala. Now, our first thought was, nobody wants to sit through 1 hour at a gala in addition to everything else. So, then we switched it back and we're like, what if we did two 20-minute sets that were broken up to give people a chance to talk and mingle in between? So, and we pitched our case for that and got them on board for that. And then we convinced them to hire an MC and do an auction, which they weren't interested in the beginning. So, as we all know in fundraising, an auction can be part of the show. So it was really a testament to them listening and coming in with an idea, but being open to, well, this is what we've done over the last couple of years that has worked quite effectively. And if you trust us, we'll give it a go. And we did. And it was a huge, huge success. But I was able to bring in Christopher, who I just mentioned, and he is a form of entertainment as a host. So we were able to give them what they didn't even know they wanted, if that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. And the one thing that and you kind of answered my next question, which was, how can nonprofits successfully work with talent and performers? But the one through line is that an organization listens, and when they listen, it will create a better product because it's like, if you're designing your house, you may have a specific aesthetic, but the designer's just going to nudge you just a little bit, and that's kind of exactly what you're doing to just kind of keep the event interesting.
Yeah. Well, and also too, because look, as those of us know, we have in most organizations, you have your high money donors who've been donating for years, and they may have a specific talent request and music request. And then we're also cultivating a new donor base, which may come from a very different demographic. So, for instance, one thing that I tend to do is how can we satisfy both? How can we give them something? For instance, we did The Impossible Dream, which is a fan favorite of years, but we just did a new arrangement of it with a huge backup choir that appealed to both somebody, whether you were 28 years old or you were 88 years old. You're going to find something that you like in both of those, and then we'll give you a classic country Patsy Cline song, but then we'll do Alanis Morissette too. Just make sure that both are equally good,
Exactly, exactly. Well, I'm glad you're giving these examples. And the one thing I kept thinking of is I kept thinking about you and kind of how are you doing this when you're a performer versus how you're doing this when you're a director? How do you approach events differently, whether you are going to be whether you're directing and you're behind the scenes or you're a personality in front of the scenes? How does your mindset alter?
Well, hugely. The first is when I'm a performer is remembering, Nicholas, keep your mouth shut. You're not in charge. so, so it's oftentimes like when I'm a performer, I tell myself, have the thought 4 times before you decide to open your mouth. Like have the suggestion, because if somebody else might be having the same suggestion and just hasn't said it because of time management. So let the director or the person in charge have their say. And if it's still not happening by the 4th time you thought it, then maybe suggest it, but then as a director, or as the organizer, because I'm a performer and know that performers often have suggestions, it is doing a lot of check-in ahead of time and letting people know in advance. This is what I've done to take care of us. Is there anything you need in advance? And always asking, what will make this run smoothly for you? And how much time do you need? How can I help you first? And then because I've already had people's checklists, um, I get a little bit more leeway and they trust that it's all going to get done.
That's a fantastic answer. And again, trust is kind of a running theme here today. It's come up 2 or 3 times, and that trust is really key and really important. And now and I know that a lot of people approach you to stuff, and you can't necessarily accept every project. So I think this is a good question for nonprofits that are looking for talent. What is a question that a nonprofit should be asking talent when they're looking to hire them for their gala or signature fundraising event?
Well, I think the first thing is to be clear with timing and also payment. I mean, that's the huge. I think oftentimes what most people when they hire an artist, and this isn't just fundraising, it's in general, they say, "Will you come sing at my such and such?" And that's all the information that there is. Like, this is our date. Will you come do it? I feel like giving as much information and thought ahead of time will help you know what your product is. And I think a lot of times having a director or somebody involved can help connect those dots of what that should be. But I think oftentimes thinking of what the budget is in general and the best way to be able to use that budget, because a lot of times these are being done by people that aren't necessarily artistic, or I don't say artistic, not on the creative end of production, to know like what the costs are versus like, oh, if you have a singer, then you have to have an accompanist and probably a band, and then we have to pay those people and then possibly feed those people. So I think really taking all that into consideration before, that will help you decide how many artists you can hire, versus just shooting for the moon. But for some organizations, money's not an issue, and they just want who they want, and that's awesome too.
And it does depend on that. And especially if you're, especially if you're a fundraiser, if it's raising like $100,000-ish, if you're looking to take it to the next level, a lot of people will often go to talent for that. So what Nicholas is providing here is really important advice for each of you as organizations as you think about that. And I know we're running out of time today, but I want to end with one final question. And that is, in your opinion, what is one thing all great galas and signature fundraising events have in common?
Well, first of all, preparation, planning, and respect. I think that if all departments are prepared and they're communicating and they have respect for all the people involved, then it's going to run so smoothly. I can't tell you from behind the scenes, whether it's as a director or performer, if people don't feel taken care of, no matter who they are, whether it's the event coordinator or the talent or the waiters delivering the food, then it's going to show. It's good. The energy in the room is not going to be good. But if everybody feels taken care of, or at least seen, it's going to go great.
I don't think anyone's ever given respect as one before, but it is so important. I'm really glad that you brought it up because respect begets kindness.
Oh, yeah.
And it creates the good environment and good feeling that you're wanting to bring. And I can't think of a more mic drop thing to say, pun intended, from the talent with that. So, Nicholas, tell people where they can find more information about you.
Sure. My website is the Nick Rod, nickrod.com. It has all of my information. Or it's my same as my handle at Instagram is the Nick Rod, and Twitter is easy to find me too. Yeah.
Well, Nicholas, again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time today. I can see why you're such a success and why you're really sought after all over the country. We talked about 3 different markets you were in today, and I'm sure there's probably 30 more we didn't even touch. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, my friend. So good to see you.
Absolutely great to see you. And that will do it for this episode of Fun and Fundraising, everybody. I'm your host, Rob Giardinelli, reminding you to keep it fun, keep it interesting, and your guests will have a great time. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.